All right, so couple things before we kind of get going here. If we look at Canvas, so I've kind of updated things. First, actually add this right now. Do this before class. So I'll kind of move this around. So I added like an assignment. Looks like an assignment, but it's basically converting your exam one score into like what it would be in terms of percentage. I also did a similar thing with exam two. So I took that extra credit survey. I converted your exam two score into a percentage, added those 4% points if you did it, so that you can kind of see what your midterm exam two was with the extra credit added in. So that's the one that I have being counted in the grade book currently. Um, so those changes were made. Other than that, we'll have a daily quiz today. Talk a little bit about this Canvas discussion at the end of class. So this is going to be the fourth Canvas discussion that's due at the end of the day next Tuesday. And then before class starts tomorrow, I'll have expected you watch that additional video I posted to YouTube along with yesterday's um, class recording. You also need to complete the Module 10 reading and then a Module 10 daily quiz that's associated with that video. So both of those are kind of due before we start class tomorrow. So if you haven't already, watch that video, kind of really focus on the last like 15 minutes or so, some of the problems we worked through. I think I'll actually touch on one of them today um, at the end of class. And that will kind of lead us into Module 11, which will start tomorrow, which is monetary policy. Okay. So the Module 11 reading, I don't have set to be due before we start class tomorrow, but before we start class on Friday. So kind of giving you an additional day to get on, kind of think about some of the things that we're going to talk about more so on Friday when you go through that reading. I will also later today post the practice problems for the next quiz. So it'll cover what we've gone through in Module 9. It'll also include Module 10 and 11, which I'm kind of combining into like one module. So some of the questions, like the second half, won't be stuff we've talked about yet, but I wanted to get those out there so you can start thinking about that fifth quiz, which will be posted after class on Friday, due by the end of the day on the following Monday. So you have a little bit of time to, the weekend, and then kind of almost 2 full days to kind of get on, take that quiz. Hopefully you're preparing for it prior to that Friday, so you can kind of have a little more time to get on and get that done. Okay. Um, Other than that, are there any kind of class logistical questions that anybody has before we just kind of jump into material here today? Okay. So where we left off was we were thinking about fiscal policy and how the government can either change spending or taxes to eliminate inflation or deflationary gaps. So one thing I kind of touched on this last class, but just to review it, we said that each change is going to have its own multiplier. So we said if we were thinking about the change in real GDP, let's assume that we wanted to keep the balance or the balance budget, the budget balanced, right? So we have the change that's going to come from taxes and the change in government spending. If we wanted those to be equal, well, we said the change in real GDP coming from a change in government spending will get multiplied by 1 over that 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. The change in taxes, that multiplier effect looked a little bit different, right? So we had marginal propensity to consume over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume there. Well, let me see if I can cut it out quite that like that. So if we want these two things to be equal, we rearranged, equation a little bit, did some algebra, and we said that the change in government spending should always be kind of change in government spending should always be that change in taxes times negative that marginal propensity to consume. This was the idea that if we increase government spending to get that same effect, we'd have to kind of decrease taxes. Okay? So what if instead we want to keep the budget balanced? So our budget was our tax revenue minus government spending minus these transfer payments. So if we actually want to keep these equal, right, an increase in government spending needs to be matched with an increase in taxes, because increases in government spending increase our aggregate demand, increases in taxes would decrease it. That amount that we would need to change taxes by, because it's getting multiplied by that marginal propensity to consume, which is always less than 1, we said that change in tax would always have to be larger. Now, in order to get the same kind of budget as before, kind of have the balance or the budget be balanced, then if we're increasing if we're increasing government spending, well, we actually would need to increase tax revenue, right? So to keep that budget balanced, we would need to kind of change these things in the same direction, because increases in government spending would kind of increase aggregate demand, decrease our budget. Increases in taxes decreases our aggregate demand, but it increases our budget. And kind of there, the relative size of what that change in taxes and change in government spending would be kind of dictated by this equation. Okay. So kind of thinking about that connection between fiscal policy, changes in either government spending or taxes, and its relationship to that budget. Okay. Now the next slide, and I won't kind of go to it here, we'll just kind of work through this example together. And I think I have here a slight typo in here, so I'll change this slide to kind of match up with what I'm about to work through. I think this is be more reflective of what you'll see on kind of that quiz. So let's say we have a consumption function, and we're told that the current level of disposable income is 1,000. Okay. So what type of gap will exist, and what should the government do to eliminate this gap? Okay. Well, if I plug in this disposable income, we get that the current level of consumption is 1,300. Right? So when we're thinking about this, we can think about this as like, if we spend all of our disposable income, this is kind of like our long-run GDP, and the current level of consumption is our short-run GDP. So in this example, actual consumption, or kind of our short-run GDP, is greater than disposable income, which was our long-run GDP. Right? So if this is the case, GDP is currently too high, we would have an inflationary gap, right? GDP is too high. What do we want to do? We want to actually lower it. So kind of what was the visual depiction of this? We said, if we've got this aggregate demand curve, we've got our long-run aggregate supply, this would be our long-run GDP. If we have an inflationary gap, we know that the current level of GDP is too high. Minus potential, or kind of short-run GDP, minus potential long-run GDP. It's actually 300 too high. So what do we want to do? We want to actually decrease that aggregate demand curve, right, by 300 units. So we either need to decrease government spending or increase taxes. Okay. So what level of government spending would close this gap? So here's where it gets a little tricky, because we've identified the gap in short and long run GDP. It's 300. Right? However, we want to reduce GDP by 300. So when we're thinking about that change in real GDP, it's equal to the change in government spending times that multiplier. If we go back to our consumption function, our marginal propensity to consume was 0.8. We want to decrease real GDP by 300. So if we kind of do this here, I get what? 1 over 0.2. So this is times 5. Right? So to get the change in government spending that would close this gap, it must be what? 300 over 5, negative 300, or I would need to decrease government spending by $60 here. Okay. So we kind of worked through a similar example last class, identifying whether or not we had an inflationary or deflationary gap using that consumption function. Once we knew the value of that gap, we could then determine what change in government spending would be necessary. Any questions on this idea? And then if we wanted to take this a step further, we could say, what's the necessary change in taxes? It'd be like the exact same thing, However, that change in taxes got multiplied by the marginal propensity to consume times 1 minus. But here there was a negative sign. Remember, increasing taxes actually decreased our GDP. So there we kind of have a similar setup, but we would have what? Negative 0.8 over 1 minus 0.8. So this would be what? Multiplied by 4. Yeah. So do the math here. The change in taxes that we would need, and there's a negative sign up front here, would actually be what? 300 divided by 4, which should be 75. Now notice here, negative divided by negative is positive because if we want to decrease GDP by 300, we either need to decrease government spending or increase taxes. And notice the tax change that we would need to get that same 300 reduction in GDP is larger than the government spending because that multiplier effect is always going to be smaller for tax changes. Okay. So a little bit of a review there. It's kind of where we left off. So the next thing that we'll kind of talk through is how do we use this fiscal policy and how some things that might complicate it a little bit. So we'll go here. I think this is slide 23. So let's think about if we have a slightly more complex model where we're looking at that long run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So let's assume that they both increase. Okay. So if aggregate demand increases, and it's doing so by an amount that's less than the long run aggregate supply increase. So we're going to end up with a recessionary gap there. So what we're going to end up seeing is that increases in aggregate demand, even if this could come from consumption, investment, net exports, or even government spending. If it's overshadowed by increases in any of those factors of pull, we could have recession or inflationary gaps created. So one of those factors would be like a growing labor force. What would this look like? And if we have a deflation or inflationary or recessionary or inflationary gap created, what tools does the government have? Well, if I have a recessionary gap and I want to increase aggregate demand, I can increase government spending or decrease taxes. That was our expansionary fiscal policy. So here I've got an example in the next slide. This is slightly more complex than what I would maybe expect you to know on the quiz or exam. Okay. So I'll kind of work through something that I'll give you a simplifying assumption, which I would give you on this quiz, that makes this a little bit easier, I think, to understand. Right? So let's say we've got our model and we've got prices here. Let me make sure. Yeah, okay. I was making sure I was not sharing my screen. I'm actually on the dot cam here. So let's say we start out and here's my long run, short run aggregate supply. Here was my initial kind of long run level of GDP. If we wanted to, we could identify kind of those prices. So we're told we have these simultaneous shifts. So you can draw these shifts out separately. It's a little bit different than the earlier modules where we have simultaneous shifts because we're not just concerned about the directional change of GDP. It's going to matter which one of these shifts increases it by more. So they could be pushing it in the same direction, and we still won't have an indeterminate answer when it comes to if an inflation or deflationary gap or inflation or recessionary gap was created. So in this example, I think I said that shift in long run aggregate supply was greater than the shift that was in aggregate demand. Okay. And I gave you the reasons, what caused that. So I think the one I did here was, let's assume we have a pretty large increase in one of those factors of pull. I think I, in the slide, said an increase in our labor supply. Right? Well, that's going to push our new long run GDP to be at a higher level. Now, initially, when we kind of had this market that was in equilibrium, our short and long run GDP were the same. We had no gap existing. Okay. So if that was the only change, well, what have we seen occur? If short run aggregate supply shifted, we would see the new long run GDP is higher than the current level. We would have a recessionary gap. Okay. Now, if we see aggregate demand increase at the same time, I think I said an increase in I don't remember what it was, investment or whatever that kind of component is. So remember, aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus net export. So change in any one of those. If it increases aggregate demand, but by a smaller amount than that change in long run aggregate supply. So the simplifying assumption I would give you in a problem like this is if you have simultaneous shifts and I tell you about the relative size of those shifts or impacts that they had on real GDP, I'll say assume that short run aggregate supply doesn't update or doesn't change initially. We know that over time, because that new equilibrium, we expect prices to be either go up or down from kind of what the current short run point is. If short run aggregate supply changed over time, excuse me, we're going to end up at this point where aggregate demand hits our long run aggregate supply. But we're impatient, right? And so we don't want to wait for that to occur. So in the short run, if the aggregate demand shift is smaller, so it still causes GDP to increase, but potential GDP from that long run aggregate supply increase is going up by an even larger amount. So if that's the case, our long run GDP is now actually greater than our short run GDP. So if current GDP is too low, we said there we would have a recessionary gap. So how do we want to close this gap? We want to increase aggregate demand even more so that we can get to this point where our new short run GDP is exactly the same as our long run GDP. So we essentially want to shift aggregate demand even higher with either government spending or taxes so that our new kind of short run GDP matches up with that new long run GDP and we would have no gap. So how do we increase aggregate demand? We said we could either increase government spending, or remember what's in C here? Consumption is like autonomous consumption plus MPC times our income minus taxes. So if we lower taxes, subtracting a smaller amount, that would increase consumption. As we lower taxes, that would also have the same impact of shifting that aggregate demand up even more, kind of closing that recessionary gap. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? So we'll hop back to this in a second, but I just wanted to kind of show you it doesn't matter. So I gave you the simplifying assumption, which was that short run aggregate supply didn't shift, but let's assume that it does. In the short run, even if it shifts as well, it likely isn't going to shift. Things can't respond as quickly in the short run. Excuse me. So that shift in short run aggregate supply will always be kind of initially less than that shift in long run aggregate supply. If that's the case and we have these simultaneous changes, so aggregate demand goes up, long run aggregate supply goes up, our new short run GDP is where short run aggregate supply, the new one, hits our new aggregate demand. So we would still have short run GDP be a little bit too low. So I gave you the simplifying assumption that there was no shift in short run aggregate supply. Even if there is, we kind of still end up with a scenario that if that long run aggregate supply shift is larger, we still end up with a deflationary or recessionary gap. If we had a recessionary gap, what did we want to do? We wanted to increase aggregate demand by even more, right? So what is that going to do as we increase aggregate demand? It closes that gap. We said we could either increase government spending or decrease taxes. But on a quiz or exam, I'll give you, that simplifying assumption about short run aggregate supply. Makes I think it a little bit easier to kind of see that if that long run aggregate supply shift is larger, we end up with a recessionary gap. Now, what if I had the opposite being true? So they both increase, but the aggregate demand increase is larger. Well, we're going to get the exact opposite effect, and I'll kind of draw this out for us, but we have an inflationary gap. How can we close an inflationary gap? Well, their GDP is too high, so we want to cause it to be lower, shifting the aggregate demand curve down. How can we do that? We can decrease government spending or increase taxes, or what we call contractionary fiscal policy. So if I wanted to do that, what would this look like? So if we had the same kind of initial, starting point. So let's say here, I've got my aggregate demand. I'm going to try to make it so I give myself a little more space. So here's long run aggregate supply. Here's my short run aggregate supply. Here was my initial long run and my initial short run GDP. And we could even think about kind of price levels here. I'll hone in this a little bit more in the second example. If we had a long run aggregate supply shift that was fairly small, yes, that's going to increase my long run GDP. However, now if the aggregate demand shift is larger than that long run aggregate supply shift, potentially I end up with something that looks like this. So I'm drawing this pretty extreme here. And what could cause this? Could be from an increase in net exports, right? So maybe aggregate demand went up because net exports increased, and maybe long run aggregate supply went up because, I don't know, we could say that education levels increased. If that's the case, where is our new short run GDP? Well, where does aggregate demand hit our short run aggregate supply curve? It's going to be up here. So now we have a scenario where short run GDP is actually greater than our new potential or our long run GDP. If that's the case, GDP is too high. We said there we've got an inflationary gap. Okay. So the exact opposite is going to occur when we have an inflationary gap. We actually want to push GDP down to this long run level. We're impatient. We don't want to wait for the short run aggregate supply to kind of adjust to the fact that we have inflationary or deflationary expectations. So to shift aggregate demand to the left or decrease aggregate demand, what can we do? We can decrease government spending or we can increase taxes. Okay. So depending on the relative size of these shifts, we get the exact opposite kind of answers or outcomes. Okay. Any questions on that before I add one more thing in here? So regardless if we have simultaneous shifts, but it works the same. I think I went through this last class, but we could kind of focus on if we have simultaneous shifts as well. Notice if we only had, so if we only had that initial aggregate demand change, okay, what would occur is short and aggregate supply would actually adjust, okay, such that our new kind of equilibrium prices would have been up here. Okay. However, when we update or we change government spending or taxes, that new kind of long run outcome will actually be at prices that are lower. So to achieve or close this inflationary gap, what did we actually do? We caused long run prices to be lower than if we would have just been patient and allowed that short run aggregate supply curve to adjust. And then the exact opposite would happen if we had a recessionary gap, where would, excuse me, prices have been? They would have been down here at that long run equilibrium if we allowed short run aggregate supply to adjust. We didn't. We increased aggregate demand, which then pushed those price levels to be higher than what they would have been if we would have been patient. Uh, Mentally to think about it. Okay. Any questions there? And so I could ask you a question like that. So if I think about in this other example, without the change in government spending or taxes, the new long run prices might have even stayed the same the way I kind of had it here if we allowed short run aggregate supply to kind of get us to that long run outcome. But because we used government spending, what did we actually do? we cause price levels in the long run to be even higher, right? So it comes at a cost. If we want to close that recessionary gap, that comes at a cost of that we're going to increase prices in the long run, or essentially cause inflation. Any questions on that before we kind of jump back into the slides here? Okay. So I have another kind of slide in here that also shows you, even if we didn't add in the assumption that short run aggregate supply doesn't shift, if it does shift, but it can't update completely in the short run, we would still end up in a scenario where after that aggregate demand increase that was larger than the long run aggregate supply increase, our new kind of short run equilibrium would be out here, still greater than our potential or long run GDP. So we would still have that inflationary gap existing if that relationship between the long run aggregate supply and aggregate demand shift existed. So we said their aggregate demand was larger. Then if we have that inflationary gap, same kind of thing applies as to what I just drew out. We would need to either decrease government spending or increase taxes to kind of close that inflationary gap. So when it comes to the quiz or exam, even though I'm giving you a depiction here where short run aggregate supply does shift, I'll give you the simplifying assumption that just assume that short run aggregate supply doesn't update initially in the short run. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. So we're now going to get even a little bit more complicated. Okay. So let's assume um, now we'll kind of step away from simultaneous shifts for a second and make it a little bit easier. So let's assume that the government engages in expansionary fiscal policy. So expansion, right? We're increasing. So we're increasing aggregate demand. How? Increasing government spending or decreasing taxes. Okay? So that's going to, if we just have that shift alone, it would increase prices and increase real GDP, right? We said expansionary policy closes recessionary gaps. Right? Now, the problem is if we increase government spending and decrease taxes, that has an initial effect on the economy. But the secondary or the crowding out effect is that when we change taxes or government spending, that impacts our loanable funds market. So I'll draw this out for us here in a second. But we said if we go back to earlier modules, once again, this is not going to be a cumulative final, but it's comprehensive in that we're using things we talked about in older modules or previous modules. So if we increase government spending, for example, that means that there are fewer funds for the government to go out and take out loans and invest in the projects. So that's going to decrease the supply of loanable funds that we have. Right? On the flip side, when we're decreasing taxes, that meant that consumers, we can think about that way, are going to have they're not going to want to protect themselves against these higher taxes. They're going to invest less, or we would see a decrease in the supply of loanable funds. So both of these changes, either an increase in government spending, decreases in taxes, will decrease our supply of loanable funds. If we go back to it, was it module 7 or 8? I think it was 8. So what is that going to do? It's going to raise our interest rates. It's now more costly to borrow. People want to make fewer investments into physical capital, or companies make fewer investments in physical capital because borrowing is more expensive. That decreases our aggregate demand because part of aggregate demand was investment in the physical capital. So that same increase in government spending is not going to have the same total effect on the economy because the secondary effect is that it also is going to end up changing the investments in the physical capital. Right? So we would still have a recessionary gap. So what does this look like? I think I've got something in the slides, but let's kind of go through. I'll build this out for us, and I think you always have those slides to go back to. So and the slide doesn't quite have as complete of a thing as I'm going to work through. Once again, value added of attending this live and making sure you're watching these videos. So we've got initial aggregate demand. We've got our long run aggregate supply and our short run aggregate supply curves. Okay. So we started out, here's our initial price levels. Here's our initial long-run GDP. Actually, what did I want? Sorry. I want to show you something first. Should have drawn that slightly differently. Let's do this again. So let's say here's my aggregate demand. Here's my long-run aggregate supply. So this would be kind of my initial long-run GDP. And let's say what I have in the slides, I want an expansionary fiscal policy. So let's say initially my short-run aggregate supply looks something like this. So initially I've got my short-run GDP is too low. Okay? If that's the case, right, I've got a recessionary gap. GDP is too low, I want to increase it. So what do I do? Okay. Well, I might think initially, okay, I'm going to increase government spending, which would increase my aggregate demand curve. Remember, this is C plus I plus G plus net exports. So we increase G, we get an increase in the aggregate demand, and we think, okay, that's great because now my short run and my long run GDP are the same. I've closed that recessionary gap. However, in response to this, if we think about the loanable funds market, and we had our supply of loanable funds, our demand for loanable funds, the initial equilibrium quantity of loanable funds, and the equilibrium interest rates. When we increase government spending, there's less available funds out there for the government to kind of use to take out loans and to pay off these loans, or so we're going to see a decrease, right? There's fewer available public funds. So we're going to get this decrease in our supply of loanable funds, which does what? Well, it decreases our equilibrium amount of loanable funds, but the thing we're going to focus on is that it increases real interest rates. Well, if real interest rates increase, it's more costly to borrow, in which case investments into physical capital are going to go down. Well, if investments into physical capital go down, what actually happens? That shifts our aggregate demand curve down or decreases it, whereas our new kind of short run GDP, I didn't save myself a lot of room here. Sorry. So after that secondary response from the loanable funds market that then impacts investment, we thought we closed the gap with government spending, but that secondary effect actually causes that GDP to still be too low, and we still have a recessionary gap. Now, the gap has gotten smaller from that government spending, but that secondary effect kind of mitigated what the impact of that government spending was. It didn't completely close the gap because of this secondary effect from the loanable funds market and its impact on investment. We didn't quite close that gap. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? Okay. So I'll go back to the slides here. Maybe another way to think about this. So let's just assume that we saw this increase in government spending. What could I also see? A decrease in taxes would kind of shift that aggregate demand out. So the initial recessionary gap, was kind of closed by our expansionary fiscal policy. But we said the response to that is going to be, that government spending or tax decreases will decrease the supply of loanable funds, which increases real interest rates, which decreases investment, and kind of causes that aggregate demand curve to shift to the left or decrease, which then our new short run GDP is still too low. It's just that, right, we've closed the gap a little bit, right? It's not what it was before, but we still have a gap existing. Any questions here? I'll kind of do the opposite as well, just so we get more practice at this. So I think here, I didn't have a depiction, but the exact opposite happens if we need to use contractionary fiscal policy. Everything kind of works just in the exact opposite direction. So I'll build out the model and it kind of hits all of those bullet points that are in the slides. So let's here try to give myself a little more room than I did before. So let's say I've got aggregate demand. And initially, here's my long run aggregate supply. Here's my short run aggregate supply. Okay. Excuse me. So I started out. Here was my short run. Here was my long run GDP. Okay. Um, so if GDP is currently too high, we would say that we have an inflationary gap. So what do we want to do? We want to lower GDP. Right? How do we lower GDP? We lower the aggregate demand curve, which we can do by decreasing government spending or increasing taxes. If we decrease, so if we do that and we say, okay, look, I've closed this inflationary gap. Okay. This is ideal. The problem is that was the kind of first effect, but it has a secondary effect, or the crowding out effect, which is it also will impact our loanable funds market. Right? So here, if I've decreased government spending, I have a larger amount of funds the government can use to then go out and pay off, or take out loans and pay them off. And so we see an increase in the amount of public like loans that are taken out from the government. Or if I increase taxes, people need to kind of invest more, save more to kind of pay off those taxes, protect themselves. And so both of those would impact, and actually I'll do a different color here. That would increase the supply of loanable funds, which does what? Lower equilibrium interest rates. If interest rates are lower, it's less costly to borrow. So if it's less costly to borrow, we would see that investment in the fiscal capital goes up. Well, once again, that's one of the components of aggregate demand. So if we, after that government spending decrease or that tax increase, we see that in response to that, investment goes up, that'll shift our aggregate demand curve to the right, and our new short run GDP would be right here. It's still too high. We still have an inflationary gap. Now, it's smaller than it was before, but it still exists. Okay. So as a thought experiment, what would the government want to do? If it can anticipate or it knows that these effects are going to happen, these secondary effects are going to happen uh, through the loanable funds market, what might they want to do? Well, if I know that a recession, or in this case, an inflationary gap is still going to exist, how would I close an inflationary gap? I decrease government spending by even more. So if we know that this is going to occur, one thing we could think about is, let's say I have that same scenario where the kind of starting long run GDP and short run GDP were right here. Well, what if the government says, okay, we could change our spending, or we could change taxes, decrease government spending, increase taxes, so that we close this, if GDP is too high, this inflationary gap. But we're going to say, well, we know that that's going to have impacts on the loanable funds market. So maybe we spend a lot of money. What would that do? Well, it would decrease our GDP by too much. We've now created what? A recessionary gap. However, the government might do that because they know as soon as they lower spending or increased taxes, what is the secondary effect going to be? Well, we said that that increases the supply of loanable funds, which cause interest rates to go down, which cause investments to go up, which cause aggregate demand to increase. So once that secondary effect occurs, potentially now the new kind of resulting short-run GDP after that secondary effect is the same as our long-run GDP, and we've closed that gap. Now, without that secondary effect, if we spend too much, we go from an inflation to a recessionary gap. But because we know that secondary effect is going to then occur, we spent more money in order to allow that secondary effect to kind of adjust us back to that long-run equilibrium where potential and actual GDP are the same or no gap exists. Okay. Excuse me. Okay. So that's what we just kind of worked through here. I left that slide blank to kind of draw those two different graphs out for us. We're now going to think about a secondary effect. So if we see these changes in government spending or in taxes, so let's first think about if I had expansionary fiscal policy. If I've got expansionary fiscal policy, I'm trying to increase GDP. One way I could do that is by reducing tax rates, right? So if I lower tax rates, if I did it through income taxes, well, if I decrease income taxes, that could potentially increase labor supply. Why? Well, first of all, if I'm thinking about working, my take-home pay is my income minus those taxes. So if I'm going to be able to get paid more from working because those taxes are lower, more people are likely going to want to join, right, the labor supply or look for jobs. Even if it doesn't change the number of workers, the existing workers, every hour I work, I'm now keeping more money. I'm going to work a higher number of hours. So we would see an increase in labor supply. If I change taxes not on consumers, but maybe I reduce capital gains taxes, the same investments that I'm making are now I'm going to get to keep more money. I have more money to invest potentially into things like education, right? Or if it's firms, they could invest that back into capital or into projects that make their capital more effective. If it's corporate taxes specific to companies or businesses, lowering taxes to them, they have more money to invest or increase their supply of capital, potentially into things like making technology improvements, which increase productivity. Um, and I kind of made a note here. All of these, it doesn't matter if the actual taxes occur right now or if we expect them to happen tomorrow. Right? Well, what is a change in productivity, education, or labor supply? It's one of our factors of pull. Right? So if we just think about when we had an increase in one of those factors, right? What did that do? It shifted our long run aggregate supply and our short run aggregate supply at the same time. Right? So the secondary effect from these changes in pull because of that change in taxes, that's actually going to increase our long run GDP. So we should see that this secondary effect increases our GDP, which may have impacts then on our inflation or deflationary gaps. Okay. Now, I'll kind of work through an example here. I'll do a kind of more simplified model first. Right? So let's assume that we have kind of simultaneous changes here, or not simultaneous, I shouldn't say it that way, that we have both the initial effect of something that changes aggregate demand, like taxes, which is specifically what we're looking at here, and then also that changes a factor of pull. So if I've got aggregate demand, I think I did a recessionary gap to kind of match up with the slides here. So here's my long run aggregate supply. And let's assume, let's go here. So the current kind of long run and short run GDP were right here. So we had a recessionary gap existing. So what can the government do to close that gap? They could decrease taxes, right? So if we decrease taxes, let's say we do right here. we might think, okay, great. We've closed this gap, right? Our new kind of short run GDP is going to match up with what that old long run GDP was. But if there's a secondary effect, which is that by decreasing taxes, so we did this through a decrease in taxes. Well, we talked about no matter what type of tax that is, it could change one of those factors of pull, labor supply, investment in education, or in productivity increases. Well, if that happens, what could we see? And once again, so here we kind of see something that looks like this. I would give you a simplifying assumption here on the quiz or exam, similar to what we had before, which is assume that there's no change in the short run aggregate supply initially. So if that was the case, we'd be looking at something like this. Our new long run GDP would be somewhere out here. Now, what has happened, right? Well, our short run GDP now is still too low. We initially thought we were closing that recessionary gap, but because of the secondary effect, which was on one of these factors of pull, we still have a recessionary gap. It's just that we're now comparing different short and long run GDP levels. And even if we did see, so just to make this point, even if I didn't give you that simplifying assumption, even if the short run aggregate supply increases, well, where would our new short run GDP be? Still too low, right? So whether or not I give you that simplifying assumption of no change in the short run aggregate supply, or we could see that it does adjust, but not completely in the short run, these changes in the tax rate, if they change one of these factors of pull, we could go from this scenario where we thought we were closing the recessionary gap, but the secondary effect that it had on long run aggregate supply, we would still have a recessionary gap existing. Now, is that a bad thing? Well, we have a recessionary gap, but what's happened to the levels of GDP? It's now higher, right? So it's good in that still this you know change in taxes increased real GDP. It's just that we weren't able to close kind of that recessionary gap or get the actual kind of current level of GDP to match up with that potential long run level of GDP. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? Okay. All right. So I get fewer questions from you guys in my earlier section, which always kind of worries me, but maybe I'm better at kind of going through it the second time. So here I kind of have basically what I just drew out for you. I think if we have time, let me see here. Yeah, so this is basically what we just worked through. Um, let's do the reverse just so we get an idea of kind of what this looks like. And let me think how I could add in a little wrinkle to this. Yeah, I know what I'll do. I'm just trying to give you guys more variations and things that you might see pop up on the quiz. So let's assume instead, so we were just looking at an example where we decreased taxes or we had expansionary fiscal policy. What if we had the opposite being true? So let's say here's kind of my real GDP. And let's say, got this idea. So here's my aggregate demand. Let's say here's my long run aggregate supply. And let's say that, let's just do an example where we start out and long run GDP is the exact same as short run GDP. Well, if this is the case, and we could do a similar example and just assume, we had an inflationary gap. But let's say that, I don't know, the government thinks there's going to be an inflationary gap, so they're preemptively trying to lower GDP. So if we wanted to lower real GDP, we need to decrease our aggregate demand curve. How can we do that? Well, we can increase taxes. So if I increase taxes, maybe I get something that looks like this, right? So I think, okay, this initial change is going to cause my GDP to be too low. If that's the case, I've actually went from no gap to a recessionary gap. Okay. Now, why would the government want to do this? They likely wouldn't, but I'm just, thought experiment here, kind of thinking about if we had things working in either direction. So that's our initial change, right? Our initial change was in taxes. If we increase taxes, we said things like investment into education, investment of companies into things that could produce new technologies, labor supply could all decrease. So here's like a weird scenario where let's just assume if we did kind of cause or have this contractionary fiscal policy, I don't know why we would want to decrease GDP levels, but it looked like we created a recessionary gap. However, if we had a really large response in one of those factors of pull, so let's say we increase taxes by enough that like we make nobody want to work. I shouldn't say nobody, but like we decrease that long run aggregate supply by a ton, right? If that was the case, hypothetically, what could we end up with? So if we increase taxes, if these factors of pull go down by a lot, notice that short run GDP level stays here. What's happened to our long run GDP level? It's now lower. We actually now have an inflationary gap, right? Now, once again, are inflation or recessionary gaps good or bad? Well, when we were talking about a fixed long-run aggregate supply curve, it was probably easy to think about like we want to close these gaps in the short run. Now, are they good or bad? Well, here we've went from a recession to an inflationary gap, but is that a good thing? Because we've forced GDP levels to be lower. All right, so it's we've caused an inflationary gap, but inflationary gaps are relative or compared to what the long run level is. If we've decreased long run GDP, that's a bad thing, right? So it makes no sense to engage in contractionary fiscal policy if we think we're going to have these secondary effects on pull because we're just lowering GDP. It doesn't matter that we've now created an inflationary gap because our long run GDP is now going to be even lower than it was before. Right? So this is kind of an example that doesn't make sense in the real world, but it's just thinking through kind of these shifts and how they work. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? Excuse me. Okay. Um, okay. We'll kind of leave it there. Go back to the slides here. So here was kind of our summary there. If we had contractionary fiscal policy and we increased marginal tax rates, lowers labor supply, one of the factors of pull, it lowered our long-run aggregate supply. And so we then ended up with, even if we had an inflationary gap initially, the drawing I had, we had no gap. Even if we try to resolve an inflationary gap, that response, that secondary response from one of the factors of pull, would cause a new inflationary gap. It might be lower than it was before, but it's still going to exist. Okay. I think we'll save this based off of where I was at in the other section. So what we'll do tomorrow, I still have some stuff I'm going to work through, but for right now, we'll save this kind of for tomorrow. So the one thing we haven't went through is this daily quiz. All right, so we'll work through the problems here, and then I've got one more thing I kind of want to work through. So let's work through these two questions. We're going to kind of take a step back, so we'll kind of revisit some things that we talked about. So let's say we have a scenario where they're starting out with no gap in potential in current GDP. If long-run aggregate supply decreases by an amount that's greater than the aggregate demand decrease in government spending, and we assume short-run aggregate supply stays the same, that's the simplifying assumption I said I would give you, then are we going to have, what type of gap will we have? And in response, should the government change spending or taxes? And I think both of these options were increase. Okay. So let's go through this and think about what this would look like. Okay. So we said we started out, here was our aggregate demand curve. Here's our long run aggregate supply curve. Short run aggregate supply. I want to make one more point here that kind of touched on already, but here's our price level. And our initial short run and long run GDP were exactly the same. We had no gap. If long run aggregate supply decreases by an amount that is greater than our aggregate demand decrease. So let's say we had one of those factors of pull for some reason, independent of taxes, change. Okay. Well, what's that going to do? Right? That kind of new long run GDP is going to be down here. Right? If short run aggregate supply doesn't adjust, right? But we simultaneously had a decrease in government spending. So this doesn't have to be a decrease in government spending. It could be a change in any one of these factors. So we could do like a decrease in net exports, but we were told that that change is smaller than the long run aggregate supply shift. So if that's the case, I'm going to draw this in pretty small here. Well, what's that going to do? It's going to push our short run GDP to be lower, right? Now our short run GDP, even though it's lower than before, it's not as low as our long run. So if our new short run GDP is greater than our long run GDP, we would say that we have an inflationary gap. How do we close inflationary gaps? Well, if we want GDP to be even lower, we need to decrease our aggregate demand curve. How do I decrease my aggregate demand curve? I either decrease government spending or I increase taxes. As a result of that, what have I done? Well, without that change in government spending, where would my new long-run price level have been if I was patient and allowed short-run aggregate supply to adjust? My price levels would have been kind of up here. But because I had that price level, I can call this 2, it's now lower than what it would have been without that adjustment. So I've closed my inflationary gap, but I caused price levels to then decrease. So I think the second part of the question was we would increase taxes in order to close that inflationary gap that existed because that aggregate demand shift was smaller than the long run aggregate supply shift. And here I did decreases. We could work, I think I did it earlier in class. We actually looked at how this would look if I had increases as well. Now, the second question, we have not simultaneous shifts, but we're going to think about these secondary effects. So let's say I've got this model where I've got aggregate demand, and we're told that we start out with no gaps. So here's my long run aggregate supply. Here's my short run aggregate supply. And I'm first asked, okay, if I have labor supply increase, so we kind of started out here. Here was our initial short and long run GDP, right? We got no gap existing. Increases in labor supply, that's one of the factors of pull, would increase our long run GDP by shifting or increasing our long run aggregate supply curve. Now, that long run aggregate supply shift, maybe I give you this simplifying assumption once again here, there was no change in short run aggregate supply. So my current GDP levels are too low. So what do I want to do? I want to increase GDP, right? So what would I do in terms of government spending? That's what the question asks. Well, I would actually need to increase government spending because I wanted to cause an aggregate demand increase, right? To close, what did we say? GDP was too low, so we had a recessionary gap. That was the response of the government to that recessionary gap that existed because of that long run aggregate supply shift. Now, the secondary effect of that, we said was going to be what? Well, if I'm thinking about, I'll draw this a little small here, but we had our loanable funds market, we had our demand, we had our supply. We're just going to focus on kind of interest rates here. When I increase government spending, there's less publicly available funds that the government can invest. So we said we saw this decrease in our supply for loanable funds. That caused interest rates to go up. Right? Probably should have used green here. Right? When interest rates go up, right, what happened to investment? Well, it's now more costly to borrow. Firms invest less. That was one of the components of aggregate demand. So that actually would cause our aggregate demand curve to decrease. Well, now where is our new short run after that secondary effect? Our new short run GDP is now too low. So that secondary effect caused what? It caused a recessionary gap, right? So we tried to solve the recessionary gap issue from that long run aggregate supply change, but the secondary effect that existed through the loanable funds market didn't allow us to close the gap. It allowed us to, close it a little bit, but a recessionary gap would still exist. So I don't think that was part of I kind of went to like a four-part question there, but we had a labor supply increase, that caused a recessionary gap. We then said to solve that, the government should increase its spending, right? And then in response to that increase in government spending, we saw a decrease in investments in the capital. Now, the fourth kind of part of that question could be if I added it in on like a quiz or exam, after that secondary effect, what exists? We just have a new recessionary gap. Right? We tried to close it, but this secondary effect from the loanable funds market, which impacted investments, caused there still to be an recessionary gap. And the same would exist if we had inflationary gaps and we tried to solve it, right? The loanable funds market adjusted so that we thought we closed the inflationary gap, but we didn't because that secondary effect kind of counteracted our initial change in government spending or taxes. Okay. Good. Any other questions there? Kind of switch gears here for the end of class. Okay. So I want to get these values correct. So let's look here. So we kind of answer those questions to that quiz, make sure you're getting that submitted. The other thing I want to look at here is I think initially there was a small typo. Well, there wasn't a typo. I wanted to make sure people were watching that module 10 video. And so I changed the values from an example that I worked through at the end. However, I realized that some people probably were used to that when we worked through these in class, they're the actual quiz questions. So they took the question I did in the video, gave that as the response to the answer for question one, but I changed some of the values. I intended to do that so that you were thinking harder about that, but I understand how there could be some confusion based off how we usually do things. So, I'm going to adjust that and give everybody credit for question one if you've already completed that. But if you're wanting to kind of review it, this is how it should be solved, and it would match up with kind of what we did at the end of that video, just with the exact same values. And so here we'll kind of go through this together. So let's say that there was like this new deposit into the Federal Reserve of 200,000 and we have a required reserve ratio. What impact is that initial investment going to have on our money supply? Okay. So if you watch that video, what I kind of walked through, and once again, really the last 10 to 15 minutes is what you want to focus on in terms of the questions I would ask you. The rest of the video is kind of discussing like the structure of the Fed. I'm never going to ask you like how many banks there are or things like that. It's really going to focus on kind of that last 10 to 15 minutes, which is what the impact of money going into the Fed is going to have, right, on our money supply. So here, if I've got a new deposit of $200,000, right? Well, the Fed sets these required reserve ratios. So here I think the initial value in the quiz was 20%, but to match up with the recording, I used 15%. So initially, when there's this deposit of 200,000, the banks would love to loan that money out. The problem is the Fed's telling them, well, you can't loan out everything. We got to make sure you have some liquid funds available. So you've got to set 15% aside. So essentially, we call this the amount of excess reserves, which is after this money is set aside, how much do they have left over? So it's the initial deposit times, well, if I set 15% aside, it's like 1 minus that required reserve ratio I have left over to loan out. This is always going to be in decimal form, so this would be 0.15. Okay. So what's my initial amount of excess reserves? I have to set 30,000 aside. I've got 170,000 left to loan out. So when I start loaning this money out, all right, I loan out 170,000. People then kind of make deposits back into the banks of this 170,000. They have to set 15% aside. They then take that money, loan it back out again. Comes back in as deposits to these banks. They have to set some of it aside, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So of those excess reserves we have left, the total effect on the money supply, or that change in the money supply, is going to be equal to whatever that initial value of our excess reserves were from that initial deposit. Excuse me, sorry. Times 1 over that required reserve ratio. Okay. So for us, that would be 170,000 times 1 over 0.15, which if I can make sure I get my math here correct. So 170, no, 0.15. We end up getting 1,133,333. So that same kind of initial deposit, right, is going to have a huge change in our money supply. Okay. So that was kind of part of what I went through at the end of the video. Once again, the values didn't line up with the initial quiz. I've updated it now, so if you hadn't already taken it, this is the exact values. You'll see it matches up with that video recording. Initially, I changed it so that I made sure you were trying to work through this, but with some different values. But I understand there could have been some confusion there. So as long as you submit that quiz, I'll give you credit for that first question of that Module 10 quiz, which is due before we start class tomorrow. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay, so some other things I want to mention before we end class here today. So kind of giving us a roadmap. You need to make sure you complete this Module 10 quiz and the Module 10 reading before we start class tomorrow. We will pick up tomorrow where we left off. So I might kind of draw out another example of changes in long run aggregate supply. I kind of went through a couple different examples here, but I'll kind of show you just to revisit it, just to kind of start off class tomorrow. And then we'll talk about tax revenues and the optimal tax to set. So we talked about there's these offsetting effects of changing taxes because changing taxes changes that long run aggregate supply. So what is the optimal amount of taxes? This will probably take us the first 10 minutes of class to kind of review where we left off and then review this idea of optimal tax revenue. We will then jump into Module 11 material. Okay. So we're going to focus now not on fiscal policy, but on monetary policy. The other thing that I want to make you aware of and kind of talk through here at the end of class is this fourth Canvas discussion. So this is primarily going to be related to what we've talked about here the last 2 days. All right, so this is going to be looking at fiscal policy and the relationship between government expenditures or spending, tax revenue, the government's budget, and then kind of changes in real GDP, thinking about inflation, deflationary gaps. So a lot of this, I'm giving you prompts, but a little bit different than some of the other Canvas discussions. These kind of parts 2 and 3 have you also trying to use your own prompts to create different graphs, right? And then evaluating what you see in those graphs and connecting it to things that we've talked about in class. So your initial post or response needs to have an answer to like 1, 1A, 2, 2A, 3, and 3A. That's worth 10 points. And then similar to kind of the last Canvas discussion, you'll need to make a post or response to 2 other students' posts. One of them, you will choose someone and look at their answer to 2A, compare and contrast their answer, right? Or the prompts that they gave AI compared to yours, and explain, kind of critique theirs or compare what they did to you, why you either got similar or different responses, or kind of why the graph you created is better, or maybe some advantages that yours has compared to theirs. You'll then choose another student, look at their response to 3A, kind of compare and contrast it to yours, critique theirs, critique your own at the same time, right? Just kind of comparing those. And each of those responses to another student will be worth 5 points, once again, for a total of 20 points on this assignment. So, you know, I have increasingly more discussions with other professors and just people in general about the use of AI. And so part of what I'm trying to do with these Canvas discussions is show you how to use it effectively, some of its shortcomings, um, ways it can save you time, ways that you need to kind of evaluate what prompts it's good at responding to, what things it's good at evaluating, graphs versus not graphs. So that'll be due at the end of the day next Tuesday. So I would suggest get on, start working on it early so that, you're not scrambling next Tuesday to get it done. Okay. Other than that, I will kind of stop the recording here, but leave it open for any additional questions that people might have. I can, there we go.